Welcome to chapter 13. Now, I know you have to be very excited because we are almost at the end of the line. This is our final module, and then the semester will be over. But with that being said, really excited that we are in this chapter as we've been talking about typologies of crime. And this has been so unique because we spent several chapters focusing on theory. And as I explained in the last module, and in previous chapters, I wanted to point out that when we go back to our typologies of crime, such as we looked at interpersonal violence, and then we also have political crime and terrorism, that any type of crime that we will discuss, or as we look at these typologies of crime, we'll still tie it to theory. So in this chapter, we're going to look at public order crimes. And public order crimes is going to encapsulate a bunch of different types of crimes, which you see as in the background of the lecture. So let's jump right in, shall we? So what is a public order crime? Well, any behavior that is outlawed because it threatens the general well-being of society and challenges its moral or accepted moral principles is what's considered a public order crime. So essentially what we're going to be looking at are what are those crimes that typically go against the grain of what society says is acceptable. So just to give you a little sneak peek, we are going to talk about victimless crimes briefly, and we'll talk about substance use in the second part of this lecture because I break it into two parts because this is one of my favorite lectures in class. We get a lot of great discussion when we get to this particular topic because these are things that most society wouldn't really, I don't want to say talk about, but it's a great talking point in a class. And we'll even talk about prostitution as well. But we know that rape and robbery or sexual assault, they're banned because they're common law crimes, right? And they cause social harm to a victim. But what about prostitution? What about pornography? What about the things that are done behind closed doors? And what about what about what people do in the privacy of their own home? So public order crimes typically create boundaries rather than bright lines. In other words, think about there's the boundary that you have to be 21 years old to drink. Now, I know a lot of you that are watching me are college students or you're young people, you're under the age of 21 and you're like, Professor Fields, hey, it's great to have a drink from time to time. I'm going to be safe. It's just a rite of passage in college. That's what you choose to do. That's what you choose to do. But think about how if you're a 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old college student, if you are caught with alcohol in your possession, you have broken the law and you will be criminally charged. On the other hand, you can go into law enforcement fresh out of high school, depending on if you did an explorers program or if you get sponsored, you go to the academy, meaning you can, defend your community, you can hold a firearm, you can arrest people, you can take a life if you're in a dangerous situation, etc. You can serve this country. Same thing, you got to be 18 years old to go into the military, right? So we see that there are boundaries when it comes to certain crimes rather than bright lines. And when we look at public order crimes, we talk about pornography, we talk about drinking, we talk about prostitution, gambling, etc. You have to be a certain age, right? So the question that is often posed is, if the act is immoral or illegal, why is it okay for some people to engage in it, but not others? Why is it okay that a 21, 22, 41, 51, 81, 71, whatever year-old person can engage in drinking alcohol, but a 17 or 18-year-old can't? However, in other countries, it's okay for a 16, 17, 18-year-old to drink, right? It just certainly absolutely blurs the lines. So what are victimless crimes, and are they truly victimless? Well, some of the notable victimless crimes can include traffic violations. Think about speeding, running red lights, running stop signs. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, Professor Fields, if you're speeding, you can crash into somebody, you got a victim. 100%. I would never dispute that, and I would absolutely agree with you in that. And when we talk about this in my in-person classes, 100% we are on board and on the same page there. But then there's other things too. What about gambling? if you're gambling, you're not necessarily hurting anybody but yourself. Now, you could be hurting your family, correct? If you have a family, but if you're a single person, or it's just and you don't have any children or other responsibilities, you're not really hurting anybody, right? Think about trespassing and loitering and, tax evasion and fraud, although those could be, you could have the government as a victim. What about substance abuse? What about using drugs? We'll get into substance abuse as well as substance use, drug use, because there's a difference between drug use or substance use and substance abuse. Those are two totally different things, but we will talk about that. And then, of course, in this lecture, first part of the lecture, we will get into prostitution. But public order crimes that violate moral order but have no specific victim other than society, those are what victimless crimes are. So again, they are considered a public order crime. They don't necessarily have a specific victim other than society or other than the person, but they typically will violate a moral order. So homelessness is not a crime, but in some jurisdictions, places like California, some places in Alabama are taking up the measure. There's other states. Generally speaking, in that jurisdiction, homelessness can be considered criminalized, or at the very least, you might get a citation. But for the most part, when we look at victimless crimes and we see victimless crimes, we don't have any particular victim other than society. And of course, the person who is doing the victimless crime themselves themselves. So what is this theory of social harm? Well, social harm is defined as the injury caused to others by willful, wrongful conduct. Anything that you do willfully and wrongly can cause an injury to someone else, whether that's, striking them, whether that's, fighting them, robbing them, whatever, but it causes a harm to others, right? And generally speaking, it's a harm to society, because anytime you have a victim, and I usually talk about this in victimology, anytime you have a victim, there is a harm not just to the victim themselves, but to society as a whole, because anybody can become just another victim. That's usually my theme in victimology. It could be you, it could be the person next to you, it could be your classmate, it could be your friend, it could be your some random stranger, but anyone could become just another victim. So there is a sense of social harm that is encountered when someone causes an injury by willful and wrongful misconduct or conduct. So immoral acts can be distinguished from crimes based on the injury they cause. For example, acts that cause harm or injury are outlawed and punished as crimes. Think about robbery, aggravated assault, any other type of felony offense is punishable by crime. But then there's also those acts which are vulgar. If you are smoking near somebody, that's not illegal, but there may be jurisdictions and city ordinances that ban and outlaw smoking. So if a police officer sees you, they're going to issue you a citation. Or you need to be smoking in a kind of a smoke zone, right? Again, you're not necessarily harming anyone else per se, unless that person's in that zone or vicinity, but you're definitely harming yourself. Public nudity, you go to some places where, you got a woman or somebody that's flashing someone. Again, that's wrong. You shouldn't do that. You might have children around, but if they don't get caught, who are they harming, correct? So again, these are kind of some other core principles when looking at this social harm. So in terms of the marijuana debate, one of the questions I like to ask in class is, are you a person who supports legalizing marijuana for recreational use? What about, are you someone who opposes legalization for recreational use, or if you're undecided? And typically, when I do this in class, I probably have somewhere in the ballpark of 70, maybe 80% who are in favor. I usually get about, maybe, 20, 25, 26% who are opposed, and then I get a few who are undecided. And the reason why they're undecided are because they just need a little bit more data, which is not wrong. But data from a Gallup poll taken in November 2023, after Ohio became the 24th state to legalize marijuana for recreational use, almost supports what a lot of my classes are, right? So 70% of Americans support legalization for recreational use, 29% are opposed to legalization, and 1% are undecided. Now listen, it is up to you where you fall on this spectrum, right? Are you a student, that's like, yeah, it's not a big deal, come on. So legalize it across the board, decriminalize it. We'll talk about decriminalization towards the end of the lecture, not this part, but in the next part when we circle back around to substance use and substance abuse. Or are you in the 29% that are absolutely opposed? Like, no, marijuana is a drug. We don't need more people who are getting stoned, and so no. Whether you are in favor or not in favor, the key thing I want to take away from, and we'll come back to this again, is that right now we are almost half of the country away from having marijuana legalized across the board. Now, will we get to all 50 states? I don't believe so. Not in my lifetime. Probably not in your lifetime. Could that happen someday? Sure. But right now, we're at 24 states that have legalized marijuana for recreational use, meaning you can legally purchase marijuana in a shop. You can legally smoke it. Now, you can't be a child or a teenager or a young person doing it, but as an adult, you can legally smoke it and you will not face any criminal penalty. That's a nightmare for law enforcement. I mean, from back when I was in law enforcement a long time ago, yeah, we were 100% opposed, and we were doing everything we can in Florida. And Florida is not a state where it's legal for recreational use. It is for medicinal use, but we have people coming in from other states saying, like Colorado and the West Coast states, saying it's a nightmare for law enforcement. It really is, because you have to remember that anyone who is smoking marijuana in a state where it is legal for recreational use, they can't be criminally charged. But what if they have something else? Now, it just becomes this murky legal nightmare. But we're going to come back to this, okay? I just wanted you to think about where you stood when it comes to this marijuana debate. And there you go. So as you see, the states where it's dark green, and again, this map needs to be updated, are all the states where it's legalized for recreational use. So you got New York, Washington, D.C. My sergeant told a hilarious story when he was in Washington, D.C. He was like, some dude was smoking marijuana, him and a bunch of the other deputies in the bureau. I didn't go on this trip, but he was there, our explorers trip. They were walking down the street, and as law enforcement, even though they're from Florida, they would still have all their badges around their neck, and they still had their firearms, and they had what's called an interlocal agreement, whereas not that they were going to apprehend anybody. They had no police jurisdiction in D.C. However, Washington, D.C. police understood that law enforcement officers from Florida were there for a school trip, so they were cool. So anyways, his funny story is, my sergeant tells a story, and I'm dying laughing. Him and a couple other deputies in our bureau, the Juvenile Relations Bureau, they come walking around the corner, and I want to say like the group was elsewhere, but they came walking around the corner, and there's an alley. A guy is smoking some marijuana in the alley. He sees them, literally almost swallows the joint or the blunt or whatever he had, and he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And they're like, "Dude, we're cops, but we're not from here. We're just from Florida, and we were just getting back to our group." And he's like, and then my sergeant says, "And by the way, dude, isn't it legal here in D.C.?" He's like, "Yeah, I know, but I just got nervous around cops." So he tells the story, and it's funny. But yeah, Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, it is legal for recreational use. You can smell it. You will probably smell it if you go up there. And you can see a lot of the states, primarily on the West Coast. Look at our southern states, where I'm at, Georgia. Nope. Only low THC, medically legal. Tennessee, a lot of the southern states, it is not legal. But this map is changing. So I just want to put it in the lecture so that way you can see, depending on what state you're from or where you currently live or where you might be thinking about moving, if that floats your boat, these are the states where it is legal for recreational purposes. So, moving along, as we continue to talk about this idea of social harm, one of the things that draws our attention are what's called moral crusaders. And moral crusaders are typically those individuals who tend to shape the law to reflect their own way of thinking. Now, the key is they believe that their way is right, and they believe that they are justified in employing any means to get their way. So think about how what I say is right, okay? I don't care what you think and what you believe, but what I say is correct. That's where the moral crusaders tend to come in. It's not a correct way of thinking, and it's absolutely wrong in many aspects. They also identify themselves as what's called moral entrepreneurs. They're going to create these moral rules, and it's going to reflect the values of those in power. Now, a few chapters ago, we talked about structural theory, right? It was a question that I like to throw out there. What is structural theory? And remember, structural theory is a theory that denotes that the criminal justice system is a means of preserving the capitalist system. However, it doesn't matter if you're in power. It doesn't matter if you're wealthy. It doesn't matter if you're up here or down here. Everybody must obey and serve the law, right? And the law is designed that it will punish people regardless of their status. Hence the quote from President Theodore Roosevelt: "No man is above the law, no man is below the law. We don't ask any man's permission to follow the law, but all men must obey the law." Right? I love that. That's why oftentimes I like to include it in exams or see who's paying attention. With moral entrepreneurs, their belief is that if we're in power, we want our values to be reflected by us in power, and we're going to set a standard on what's right, what's wrong, and we're going to feel like we're justified when it comes to certain things. So look at some of these topics. Again, very controversial, but I like to have the discussion in class. Prayer in school. Oklahoma passed a law. It allows for the displaying of the 10 Commandments. Some people will say that's not right. What if you're Jewish? What if you're Muslim? What if you're an atheist? Whatever. Again, whether you are religious or not religious, prayer in school becomes a very controversial topic depending on who you ask. Gun ownership. We can argue and talk about the Second Amendment for days on end. Some people are like, nope, we don't need to be having all these firearms. Others are like, you need responsible people using firearms. But it becomes a hot button topic. Same-sex marriage. The Obergefell v. Hodges 2015 case, that case was a landmark decision that legalized same-sex marriage. Well, moral entrepreneurs are even now in modern day, like as in right now, are working to get the Obergefell v. Hodges case overturned because of their them being, again, same-sex marriage. But again, where do you fall? Are you on board? Are you like, I don't care? Are you like, nope, shouldn't happen? Abortion, we just had the Dobbs decision several years ago. Abortion has been overturned. Roe v. Wade banned books. Certain books you can't even have in schools. And then, of course, sexually explicit books and magazines. So moral entrepreneurs, they look at these different topics, which are very controversial in its own right, and they go, this is what we have to say as it relates to these topics. So let's talk about paraphilias. Now, as you see the disclaimer, the warning disclaimer sign, I always put this up in my in-person classes, primarily because I just want to let you know that we're going to talk about some things that are a little bit sensitive, that can be certainly sensitive to other people, but I do it as a courtesy to the students and before we get into it. So a paraphilia is a bizarre or abnormal sexual practice that may involve non-human objects, humiliation, or children. It is absolutely illegal. Here are some of the notable outlawed paraphilias. We got frotteurism, rubbing against or touching a person in a crowd, elevator, or other public area. Voyeurism, obtaining pleasure from spying on a stranger while he or she disrobes or engages in sexual behavior with another. Think about like the peeping Tom. I like to warn a lot of my female students, especially those that are on campus, that live in dorms or live in apartments in and around town. Hey, if you got a first floor apartment, even a second floor apartment for that matter, you might be like, I'm free and whatever, but please close your blinds. You don't know who's lurking in the bushes. You don't know who's flying a drone. Just be safe because somebody could be practicing voyeurism. Exhibitionism, that's where a person is giving sexual pleasure from exposing their genitals or sexual organs to surprise or shock a stranger. So think about the flasher, right? Person walks around, trench coat, opens up, flashes, and takes off running. That's an exhibitionist, right? Very illegal. They'll get arrested if they do it. Sadomasochism, deriving pleasure from receiving pain or inflicting pain on another. Pedophilia, this is sexual pleasure or through sexual activity with children. We'll talk about that. Very disturbing, very illegal, very disgusting. And then necrophilia, again, something that we have to throw in there. It's a paraphilia. Ted Bundy used to do this. He used to get engaged in necrophilia. That is where there is pleasure with corpses or dead bodies. So why do people engage in pedophilia? Well, the pedophilia next to necrophilia, in my opinion, is the one that has the most concern in the public. Now, if you are a voyeur, right, and you want to be a peeping Tom, again, you're going to get arrested, you're going to be in trouble, right? But you can probably get some treatment, get some help, and be cool, right, and be on your way. If you're an exhibitionist, you're the person that likes to go around, male or female, flashing people, showing off your genitalia. Once again, you're going to get in some trouble. You're going to go to jail. You're going to have to go to court. You're probably going to get some treatment. You should be good. When we get to the pedophilia, it is very disturbing because it involves children. Men and women can engage in this type of behavior. And the question becomes, what is the satisfaction in showing or engaging in sexual relations with a child? What is the allure to that? What is the draw to that, right? So when we look at what causes pedophilia and what are some of the suspected causes, first of all, we have the abnormal brain structure. Think about trait theory. The abnormal psychological trait that may cause individuals to engage in crime. Along the lines of trait theory, we get the neurological dysfunction, brain trauma. I had a probationer who had a significant brain trauma when he was around maybe 10. He fell off a truck and hit his head very hard on the concrete. He was never the same, saying that he was engaged in significant sexual misconduct with children, so much so that he ended up being committed to a long-term high-risk sex offender treatment program, and then he was, because findings of fact were made, he was ordered to be a registered sex offender. What about inherited genetic factors? Is it possible that a person may have had a dad or a grandfather or some other family member that engaged in pedophilia and it was passed down? It's possible. Cognitive distortions, of course, the sexual obsession with minors, and then exposure to pornography. Think about social learning theory. If you're seeing things on TV, on your internet, online, wherever, you're more likely to act on those behaviors because of what you visually saw. So let's jump into prostitution, right? Again, this is another public order crime. Typically, prostitution is granting non-marital sex for remuneration under terms established by mutual agreement of the prostitutes, their clients, and their employers. So simply put, prostitution or the prostitute is offering their body for sale, okay? You want my services, you want to purchase my body, and if you are in agreement of my terms and conditions, then we can engage in a transaction where you will receive pleasure from my body and I will receive something in return. Now, in this process are some of the elements. First of all, the activity has a sexual significance for the customer. So the customer establishes what they want from the individual. Maybe they want I don't know. I'm not even going to jump in there, but they might have something that they want, right? There's a sexual significance, so they have something that they want, and the individual who is the prostitute or engaged in prostitution will say, yes, this is okay, or no, this is not okay. In terms of the economic transaction, there's something of an economic value. Sometimes it may not be money. I heard this wild story a few years ago. Some folks were chit-chatting around a fire, and they talked about some escapades in another country. And one of the gentlemen had the nerve to tell me and another guy that, in in this particular country, all I had to do was buy the person who was offering the services a microwave. And I basically had this person for the entire weekend. And I'm like, what? But again, it's just one of those things where it may not necessarily mean a monetary transaction, but because this was a foreign country and because I guess the cost of living or, there's a level of poverty there, buying a microwave was an economic transaction in and of itself. And then there's the emotional indifference. The interaction has nothing to do with affection for one another. It's strictly business and pleasure. You can't be like, I'm falling in love with you. Please marry me, or, man, I love you so much. When am I going to see you? And can I call you tonight? They're going to be like, lose my number or we're done, but there's an emotional indifference. So prostitution definitely is a public order crime that we have to strongly look at with these different factors. And it includes these elements as well. In terms of the incident of prostitution, the UCR says there's fewer than 50,000 arrests made annually. It used to be about 100,000 arrests in the 90s. I'm thinking back then when I was, a kid. Yeah, anytime you heard about prostitution, I just thought of Vice, right? And people trying to nab prostitutes off the streets. It was like a major epidemic of black eye on society. But now you don't really hear about it as much, right? Well, for starters, some of the factors that account for the changes include, one, men are less likely to use prostitutes, and they have other alternatives. They have cyber, they have mutual encounters, there's other things that are out there that they can use. The prevalence of STIs or STDs, sexually transmitted infections or diseases, makes people think twice. Doesn't mean that they won't try to engage in prostitution, but just because of that, whereas you look at the 80s and the 90s, people weren't really paying attention to those, and they were catching STDs and STIs, and it was changing their lives. So as we get to modern times, people are like, I don't want to take that chance. But the other part of that too is you got to think about prostitution abroad. So business is flourishing and booming abroad, especially in European countries. Now, not all European countries, but many European countries. For example, if you have ever gone to Amsterdam or you want to just look up something that's crazy, just go type in Douala and look up the red light district in Amsterdam. That's a destination for international sex tourism. I had a former intern who told me her and some friends went to Douala and they just wanted to walk around just to kind of take it all in. They had no intention of purchasing services. It was just more or less, as Americans, they wanted to go ahead and take it in. And she told me, she was like, it's just like what you hear on the movies or see on TV. It's anything you want, and they're right there in the window, and you go in and you purchase the services and you go on about your business. But again, it's a billion-dollar industry. It's booming. Whereas if we go to many Muslim and Islamic countries, the punishment of prostitution is death. If a woman was going to engage in that type of behavior, she would have to be very discreet, or she can run the risk of even losing her life. So what are some types of prostitutes? So we got the streetwalkers. They walk in plain sight of police, plain sight of citizens and customers. Usually they're called hustlers or hookers or streetwalkers. Sometimes they're controlled by pimps. You probably won't see streetwalkers as much, but they're very obvious. They dress a certain way, and you know them once you see them. You get your bar girls or your B girls. They spend times in bars. They drink. They wait to be picked up by customers. So, you go out to eat, and, you're a single person, and you're sitting there, and you look, and you see somebody sitting at the bar. Just see what they're going to do. See if they're waiting for somebody, or maybe they're waiting for someone to come over and talk to them. Sometimes you can kind of pick up on what a person's demeanor is, what they're trying to offer. But typically with the B girls, again, they're going to be in bars. They're going to be in populations where they can probably pick someone up. You got your brothel prostitutes, though also known as bordellos, cat houses, sporting houses. They're usually run by madams. The madam would get 40 to 60% of the proceeds from the prostitute's deeds. Now, listen, the way I look at it, especially since these are found commonly in Las Vegas, in and around Vegas, if you are a worker and you live in a bordello or you live in one of these brothels and you made $1,000 and the madam is getting 60%, well, she just pocketed $600. You're only left with 400. Now you might say, well, Professor Fields, that's not a bad deal because she's housing them. She's probably providing them electricity, food. You know, the money they keep is just, they don't have to pay for anything. That's assuming they don't have any debt, don't have any, creditors or anything like that. But still, I mean, that's pretty steep to have to pay up to 60%. You got call girls. They're found in wealthy, affluent areas. Sometimes they can be found in DC. They can charge thousands of dollars per night. And usually they just want to make the client feel very important. Think about how, I hate to use DC, but it could be a politician. It could be someone that's working a congressional job, a staffer. They have an event. They don't want to show up without a girlfriend, without someone, so they might get a call girl. There may be nothing sexual about it, but the call girl is accompanying them to make them feel special and make them feel like wanted. You got your escort services or call houses. They're pretty new. The madam gets a call from the prospective customer. If they find the client as acceptable, the meeting will be arranged for services. It's very close to the brothel. The only difference is that you're calling the madam up. Whereas the brothel or the bordello, you're showing up there. The madam is still running it. But in this case, you just go in there and be like, hey, I want Becky, I want Susie, I want Tammy, whatever. But with the escort service, you see, there's Jenna and there's Marie and all this person. But you can't just call Jenna. You got to call the madam. And the madam will say, yes, you're acceptable. You meet me first. And then you can engage in services with the person. So that is a new concept. You got your circuit travelers. These are where they move around in groups of 2 or 3. They might go to lumber, labor, agricultural camps. They'll ask the foreman for permission to provide services to workers. Usually the foreman is getting a kickback. So because they're going to go talk to the foreman or they're going to talk to the person that's in charge, and they'll say, yes, you can operate here, but it's going to cost you guys, I'm just saying, $100. So each person will pay $100. And because the foreman knows that, hey, I know I got men and I got people that are away from home and they need services and relief, it's okay. I'm turning a blind eye. Nobody's going to call the cops, and I'm going to make sure you're protected, right? They can also be found at truck stops. So when you're traveling, if you're going to Love's, if you're going to Flying J or Pilot or some of the major travel stops across the country, don't be surprised if you had a circuit traveler that's showing up there just trying to say, hey, does anybody need any services? And again, it's very discreet, it's very low key, but people know what they mean. Now, what these are called, and it's a hilarious term. I used to write it on the board as a bonus question. They would be called lot lizards. Lot lizards. So I don't know why that term came up, a lot lizard, but it's a hilarious term. I never heard of it until a student of mine brought it to my attention. And she was like, Professor Fields, you know what those were called? And I was like, no, what are they called? She's like, oh, they call them lot lizards. And I'm like, what? And I looked it up and I was like, holy smoke, she's right. Yeah, lot lizards. That's what they'll call them. They'll hang around. I guess they're like lizards, and then they want to go ahead and engage in these services. But lot lizards. And then lastly, we have the e-hookers, and they can be found online in the posted ads. Craigslist and Backpage, they were big. Law enforcement shut those down. But you got other things that are out there. Adult Friend Finder is popular. A lot of other stuff that's available for individuals to find services online. Again, it's only a matter of time before the police shut those down too. But the way, from what I understanding, these new sites work is that they're not trying to advertise full-blown prostitution. They're looking like, hey, I'm just looking for some companionship, or I'm looking for somebody that wants to be a friend. But then once you start talking to the person, they're like, okay, these are my services, this is what I do, and that sort of thing. So how does one become a prostitute, right? Well, male and female prostitutes, sometimes they come from troubled homes. They have extreme conflict. They may deal with hostility. They can sometimes come from poor urban areas, or they can come from poor rural communities. But when people come from a lower socioeconomic class, when they do poorly in school, when they have substance abuse issues, PTSD, it's a perfect recipe that will allow them to potentially engage in prostitution simply because they're considered throwaways, right? They're not going to achieve, they're not going to succeed. They've been victimized, they've faced trauma, and they are considered throwaways. Sexual abuse plays a key role as well. People who are abused, especially as children. And that's why we go about back to the pedophilia, and we'll talk about it one more time, because when a child is abused, imagine the psychological damage that's going to give that child, right? The child is going to face a significant level of psychological damage and trauma that they're not going to be able to generally overcome that unless through counseling and through the right types of mental health services and treatment. So sexual abuse plays a key role in individuals engaging in prostitution, especially if it happens at a young age. Now, sexual exploitation is another thing to watch out for. And it's something that's big in my area, the Atlanta area, the metro Atlanta area. You know, you get young girls as young as 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. They're at risk. You can't have a 12, 11, 13-year-old girl just walking home from school. Not around here. She better have 2 or 3 people with her, or she better get a ride. You can't have her walking home from school. And I personally dealt with this as a probation officer. But even in the midst of becoming a prostitute, engaging in sex work is dangerous, right? You deal with abuse from pimps. You have to deal with abuse from clients or the Johns. You have to worry about being caught and being arrested. Of course, you know that substance abuse is, you have to find a way to cope because your body can't deal with that trauma. If you're a female, you're a woman, your body can't deal with the trauma of being with different guys. Not to be graphic, you can't. So sometimes they have to find a way to cope. And how do they cope? Using illegal substances. That's the best way. Takes away the pain, keeps them going because they got to make their money. So should prostitution be legalized? Well, some will say, okay, well, maybe it should be a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine or jail sentence. Law enforcement are uneven because we know prostitution is legal in Nevada. It's not legalized in the entire country. Then you get the sexual equality view. Remember, this kind of goes back to critical feminist theory. The prostitute is the victim of male dominance. When we looked at critical feminist theory several chapters ago, as women make significant inroads to success, financial success, leadership positions, etc., they're more likely and more susceptible to becoming victimized by men or put down by men. Well, it's the same thing here. Some will say that, you know, prostitutes are the victim of male dominance, and males are, this is a male-dominated society, and males are the ones primarily trying to keep women from benefiting from their body. Speaking of which, free choice view. Prostitution, if freely chosen, expresses women's equality. As you see from the signs, this person says, sex work is work. My body is my business, right? So for some people, they're like, look, if I want to sell my body, why can't I sell my body? Okay? If I want to provide services and somebody's willing to pay for my services, just because you don't want to pay for it or you don't like it, doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen. Again, these are just some of the arguments that come up. And then, of course, we have this notion that legalization may not be better. For example, sometimes these women who live in the brothels suffer from significant abuse and psychological damage and trauma. The brothel owners are not much better than pimps on the street. Remember what I told you? The madams take up to 60%. So if you made $1,000 in a transaction or during that week, they're taking 600 of it. They're not even taking half or less than half. They're taking more than half, right? You still got to deal with STIs. You still got to deal with verbal abuse and violence. So legalization may not always be the best answer. It could be an answer, but until you legalize something and see if it works, and then if it doesn't work, you have to criminalize it again, which is probably harder than legalizing it. But it's not always the answer. It's not, because these are still other factors and issues that women may deal with. So let's quickly talk about pornography as we're about to wrap up this first part. Well, pornography includes sexually explicit books, magazines, websites, films, DVDs, etc. And it's offered for the gratification and excitement of paying customers. Now, you probably can find porn or pornography online for free. But either way, generally speaking, for the most part, what pornography is it's just sexually explicit items, imagery, movies, websites, whatever. And these are websites that, generally speaking, children or teenagers or the common public should not be able to get onto, right? What brings up the question why it sometimes becomes a public order crime is because it can lead to this thing called obscenity, right? If we see or view material that violates community standards of morality or decency, that's where it becomes obscene. So a person showing pornography to minors absolutely can be criminally charged because it's considered obscene. If you're at the public library, wherever you live, whatever city you live in, you go to your public library and you walk by a computer and you see a man just watching full-blown pornography, and you're like, whoa, what are you doing? There's children over here, or he's doing something he shouldn't be doing, to himself. That's obscenity, right? That person's going to get kicked out, might even get arrested. And so a question I would ask in class is, would you be okay with people having to show ID to access pornographic websites or self-regulated sites and imagery? For example, OnlyFans. Does anybody have an issue with that? I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, what about our Fourth Amendment, which protects us and provides a right to privacy, right? Could we argue that our Fourth Amendment protections are going to be violated because in order to access this pornographic site, I have to pull out my license, hold up my license, and let the camera see my license, and then it can let me on the site. Well, who's collecting that data, right? Who's looking at that data? What if that data gets dropped in a leak? And we'll talk about leaks in the final chapter of the semester, because something major happened with a leak, and it caused devastating consequences for some of the people involved. But it does beg the question: what about our right to privacy? What about our Fourth Amendment protections? So the last thing, when we look at pornography, is it harmful? Absolutely. Kiddie porn, or child pornography, as it's commonly called, is very harmful. It is very illegal. 1 million children are believed to be exploited in this form of pornography. Now, they have something called the ICAC, Internet Crimes Against Children. ICAC typically they work very closely with law enforcement, or they are within law enforcement, and generally they're the ones who are trying to nab the horrible, despicable, perverted people that engage in child pornography. And when I was at the sheriff's office, we had an ICAC unit and detectives. You have them at police stations. You probably have them at federal law enforcement agencies. Excuse me, but they're the ones that are trying to get these people who are engaged in looking at child pornography. And it's unfortunate, because there are people out there that's what they like. It's just horrible. It's despicable. But that is the most dangerous form of pornography. Now, any pornography can be dangerous. People can act on it. They can decide, I saw this and I want to go ahead and do this against men or women. But child pornography is the most dangerous. It's the most harmful, and is absolutely the most illegal. So does pornography cause violence? Well, there is a link between consuming pornography and subsequent violent or controlling behavior, especially if you look at violent pornographic imagery. The thing that I like to say is, if you can see it, you can act on it. There's an old saying that the eyes are the window to the soul. So if you can see it, you can absolutely act on it. So we're going to stop right there. We will pick up our second part of public order crimes. In that part, we're going to jump right in talking about substance use and substance abuse. But thank you for tuning in. Take care, and I will see you next time.